Hey, and what's up, everyone? I hope that you're all doing well. I'm here to reply to some of the questions that have come out of last Sunday when we looked at Ruth chapter 2, which, if you know, is this beautiful story of Ruth meeting Boaz for the first time, right? Ruth was a Moabite, a foreigner. She's gleaning in fields that's not her own, and she's doing so for herself and her mother-in-law, Naomi, who was also a widow. But then she meets Boaz, and Boaz is a man of noble character, and he meets Ruth. He notices her in the fields, and he meets her with welcome and protection and warmth and hospitality. I'm here to answer some of the questions about the setting of Ruth and her stakes and her vulnerability, as well as questions on redemption, what it meant back then, and also what it looks like now. So let's get into it. First question is this: what were the real dangers Ruth faced as a foreigner gleaning in the fields? Was she in that much danger among God's chosen people in that time? That's a great question. Helps us to understand the setting. Quite simply, there was great reason to think that Ruth was living in a time where it was very vulnerable to be a foreigner, even in God's land. We see that in chapter 2, verse 9, right? When Boaz says to Ruth, find which fields that my female servants are harvesting and follow them. Haven't I ordered the young men not to touch you? Oh, why would he need to say that? And then later on down in verse 15, right, Boaz again orders his young men, again, let her even gather grain among the bundles and don't humiliate her. In other words, there was every reason to believe that a single, attractive foreigner, someone who was not God's people, would find themselves in a very vulnerable position if they were to be gleaning on their own. And Ruth would have been absolutely one of those people. You know, we'd like to think, right, that God's people wouldn't be doing this sort of thing, right? That Bethlehem, Judah, I mean, you know, these are God's people in God's land, you know, more would be expected of them, right? They were God's chosen people. But that actually isn't the case nor the reality. We have to remember something, that this was set in the time of the judges. And in the time of the judges, there was no king in Israel, man. Everyone did that which was right in their own eyes. In other words, this was a wild time to be alive, where God did not have a king who ruled over his land and ruled with his word. This was a time when people went rampant, and so it was a particularly vulnerable thing for Ruth to get into. And it's also a sober reminder, I think, about what people, even God's own people, are capable of, stooping the kinds of levels of base level behavior which we see have been a real possibility here. It's a sober reminder of that as well. I hope that answers the question. Next one. What is the equivalent of a kinsman-redeemer in our day? That's a terrific question, you know, because whenever we read stories like Ruth in the Old Testament, we'd like to see how it connects to present-day concepts and what that concept would mean for today. Now, the kinsman-redeemer idea is really bound up in part custom, but also part law. The law part comes in Leviticus chapter 25 and other places, which allows a deceased man's property to be purchased by their surviving relative, okay? Now, this was in order to protect that land from going to waste. It was meant to preserve the family line so that it would continue on, and it was meant to also guard the original allocation of God's land for God's people. That was the redeeming aspect of it in terms of levirate law. The custom of it also involved marrying into that family, and marrying in terms of the household, taking on the spouse, taking on the widow in question. And so there was actually a custom about that too. And so Ruth's story is actually well situated in that time. It's almost impossible to find a like-for-like equivalent for that sort of thing today. Nowadays, right, if you have lost a spouse or if you're widowed, you know, there are all kinds of civic protections, right, in order to protect the widows in that scenario, protect divorcees and single parents and so on and so forth. So it's very difficult to see that equivalency, I guess you could say. However, that said, the dynamics that we see at play in the Ruth story regarding a kinsman-redeemer is that here we find a person who comes in from the outside, as it were, to redeem someone from the outside. We see someone who shows enormous courage in buying back something that that didn't have to, they weren't obligated to, and to do so at great personal cost, and to do it with unceasing kindness, right? That concept, and we're going to talk about this, called redemption, is in fact what we see power the story of Ruth throughout the whole book, and therefore, in a way, it kind of gets us thinking about, if the way to restoration and the way to be redeemed is through a figure who would take me in from the cold, who would do so at great price, at great cost, and with unceasing kindness, and to restore me so that when I was just about as good as dead, he'd lifted me up and put me into a firm place of salvation and renewal and restoration. That's the dynamic of the gospel. And so I almost want to say that even though there's no figure of the kinsman-redeemer today, that is the aspect and the attributes that all Christians should have. All Christians, having been redeemed by the gospel, which is a gospel of salvation that has purchased us, right, from death to life, from darkness to light, right, ought to be living that out. The engine of that ought to show and find expression in all kinds of practical ways. And so I hope that answers the second question, because it also links to the third question, and we'll close with this. I want to hear more of what that redemption looks like fleshed out in our daily lives. Here's the question. What are some other similarities or similar words to redemption? It sounds pretty Christian. Can I go into it a little bit? Absolutely. You know, from what I've said, it's pretty clear that the idea of redemption, both in Ruth and in the dynamic of the whole Christian idea of salvation, is that we are purchased, bought back, bought back from some place that we shouldn't be, and restored to some place where we ought to be. That is really the essence of what redemption is about. It's the definition of redemption. To buy back at great personal cost, through no obligation of that person alone, and to do so with unceasing kindness, and to restore them and to renew them in a place where they ought to be, where they could be flourishing and to find the newness of life that God has designed them to be. That, in a nutshell, is really what redemption is about. And so I can think of other similarities, or some other similar words, I guess, of redemption, like purchase, like to ransom, to this idea of redeeming means to make, means to repurpose, or to restore, or to bring back from the brink, and to give a new life, a new lease of life, I guess you could say, a new beginning. Oh, that's a good idea as well. These kinds of words all convey that similar meaning. And what we see in Ruth is a picture-perfect blueprint of what later on the redemption that you and I received has come about. Because in the Lord Jesus, what Boaz did for Ruth and Naomi, Jesus has done for us. And that is the beautiful idea that makes Ruth point so gloriously to the future Messiah that was to come. Because like Boaz, Jesus also took us in from the cold. Like Boaz, Jesus also showed extraordinary integrity and kindness. And like Boaz, he did so at great cost to himself, at the very cost of his death, so that we can be brought into his family. We will be his heirs, his sons and his daughters. And that is the most important thing to understand about redemption in the Christian Bible. But it doesn't leave us there, because what it also does is that it makes us vessels of redemption and restoration everywhere around us. Well, what does that look like? What does, practically speaking, redemption would look like in the everyday? There can be many things that I say, but I tell you, the image and the story that comes back to me again and again is from a movie. It's a very famous movie. It's from Schindler's List. You probably know the one I'm talking about. You may have seen it. It's a classic, right? The 90s movie from Steven Spielberg is a story of how Oskar Schindler, who was a German, rescues and redeems and buys back all of these Jews that were doomed to die, all right? And he does it through bribery, he does it through scheming, but he has a change of heart somewhere during the movie, and this man, this very well-to-do, successful entrepreneur, begins to soften in his heart. He has a change of heart, and then he begins using his power, using his resources to slowly but surely bring the Jews back from certain death and into life, okay, protected under the cover of his company. Now, there's one scene, a very famous, very powerful scene, when he's talking to the German commandant. His name is Amon Goeth. He's the antagonist in the movie. And explaining to him his plan without explaining to him his plan, right? He wants to get people for himself. And Amidgurt, in a striking moment of irony, he says to Oskar Schindler, "Who are you, Moses?" and then they were on the balcony and they were drunk, and the line was pretty much a throwaway, but it was significant because in that moment, Oskar Schindler was being like a Moses. He was using his resources and his know-how and his company and his enterprise to save and bring back people from the brink of death, okay? And so that was the picture that's always come to my mind when I think about practical redemption. It is using your position, using your resources, using your power, not for your own gain, but for the benefit of others, so that others will be brought back to where they shouldn't be and restored to where they ought to be, where they can thrive and where they can flourish. And in that sense, I have to say that practical redemption in the everyday looks a lot like leadership in its best and purest form. Because leadership in the best form is about not using your power and abusing your power, but laying down your power in order to lift others up, in order to bring people out from the brink. And this could look like a ton of ways, a diverse number of ways in all kinds of situations. Some of us are perhaps bosses or landowners, or we are superiors with people under us. So redemption in that sense would be to make the most of the situation you have in front of you, and to bring those kinds of people into flourishing and life and fullness. It could look like very drastic things, like bringing someone in from the cold in terms of adoption, finding someone who's very vulnerable, or if you're in a relationship in a community where there are people who are struggling and they are in the outs and they're stigmatized and they're broken and they're depressed, that you invest yourself into that person and you bring the best out of them. You retrieve the evil that's out of them and you restore them as much as you humanly can into good, and you use it with your resources and your personality and your money even, and everything that you have at your disposal. It is dispensing power for the benefit of others. And I think the dynamic of redemption actually works in that sort of way. That's exactly what Boaz did from his position as a successful landowner towards Ruth and Naomi, you see, but only if he has the favor of God enough to extend it to others. That was the point as well in the sermon. We need to understand that this doesn't come easy, it doesn't come natural. And while people can still do some good who are not part of God's people, we need to make sure that we recover firstly that the redemption, the ultimate redemption, has been won for us. That is the only power that makes possible your redemption for others. And so I hope that gives you a little hint about what that may look like. I hope that it will expand your creativity in other ways. And I hope that you'll keep sharing the stories of practical redemption, practical restoration in your everyday lives. Because as we do that, as a community of God's people, I guarantee you, God is being exalted because the dynamic of redemption is being talked about, lived out, and celebrated, even in small ways. And that, I think, is a terrific thing for the growth of God's kingdom. Well, I hope that's helpful in terms of answering those questions. Let me know what you think. Leave a comment on the YouTube link or the page. But I will continue to do these Q&As. They're rather fun for me. Helps me to think about what I have been preparing. And also, I hope that it'll benefit you. But till then, bye for now. Take care of each other. Love you guys.